Hi, this is Eternal King here, bringing you another LOR video today. So I want to talk about the upcoming patch for the new season of Eternal. Basically some nerfs to cards, mostly eddy-specific cards, and a little bit to Hecarim. The patch is exceptionally light, so this is not going to be a long update video. I'll pass on some gameplay when I'm climbing ladder in the new season, because again, this patch hasn't really changed anything about the way that I have to climb and what's good, and I'm going to get into that for a second. But if you want the quick takeaway, I think this patch is disappointing, and I'm going to go into why. First thing, talking about 6-drop changes. So again, Enraged Fire Spitter, its damage is being nerfed again. The play effect is the exact same. You still get the 2 damage and the 2 damage. So in terms of being an aggro top end and something like Annie-Jin, you're not going to care about the removal of stats. You're still playing this card for the 2 damage to, say, a Chumper, and then the 2 damage to Nexus, and then dragging a third thing, and then swinging with your entire board. You're still running this card, even with the reduced stats, and I believe it's like a 4-3 or something. Like it doesn't matter. You're still running this card. In Eddy, however, it's very possible you don't. This nerf will matter a slight bit because Eddy likes being bigger than everything else, and so Enraged Fire Spitter no longer fits into that game plan quite as well. You don't, for example, I think the big reason they made this change, the one that matters the most, is Deathless Fire Spitter. So you play Fire Spitter, and it comes down with Deathless, and then you just like have this massive, you have a 6-4, and then it dies, and it's a 6-1, and it's presenting like 6 Nexus damage on the next attack, even if you trade into it. And like, I understand why they nerfed it. I'm just saying that this nerf isn't as impactful for Eddy as people think it is. Because at the end of the day, every single Eddy deck that is good is a Cloud Drake deck. Right? Cloud Drake is still going to be 6 mana, 6/6 with Challenger and Fury. It says when I'm summoned, reduce the cost of all allied units in hand. Not dragon units, not dragon tribal units, all units. So what you increasingly see with Eddy decks is that Cloud Drake goes in everything because everything benefits from Cloud Drake. Any creature-based strategy benefits from Cloud Drake, more specifically Eddy decks where you have a very high curve, because you, again, everything is 6 mana and up. But there's no reason why you wouldn't run Cloud Drake in an Eddy deck, and that has not changed. So without the Cloud Drake nerf, all these other nerfs don't really matter because you can just substitute those 6 drops that were nerfed with other 6 drops. But you don't substitute Cloud Drake because it's still just as good as it used to be. I think Cloud Drake could have been 7 mana pretty easily. It would have cut down on things like 7 mana Matron. A lot of the Spectral Matron on 7 with Cythria, 10 mana Cythria, and like the really nasty stuff you can do in Eternal, which is basically Cloud Drake on 6. You ramp into the Cloud Drake, then you play the Spectral Matron on 7, and then that brings out the 10 mana card. And that's like one of the most broken things you can do in the format. And so nothing about the way that I have to play against Eddy, and like again, I'm very good at countering Eddy. I can counter Eddy in something like 90% of games, but like it doesn't really, the patch isn't changing anything. I still have to play this exact same decks. I still have to play around Eddy in the exact same ways, and I still have to deal with the meta that is still going to be the same meta. Nothing has changed whatsoever in terms of Eddy. So again, going into some of the other changed cards. So rather than reducing the cost of Cloud Drake with its free mobilize on a 6 mana body, they increased the cost of Horned Swarmcaller. Now, Horned Swarmcaller is literally only a card that matters in the mirror. So this being 7 mana literally does not matter unless you're playing other Eddy players. Hence why I think this patch is literally just for standard players. That's basically it. Because I guess if you're a standard player and you're playing Eddy against Eddy, Horned Swarmcaller removing your Deathless from your own Eddy cards is probably really frustrating. But otherwise, it doesn't really matter. Like, if you're playing an elusive spam list, yes. Ooh, Horned Swarmcaller costs 1 more mana when you have Cloud Drake to reduce it by 1 anyway. Sure, that's probably warranted, but like again, it just does not matter because you have Cloud Drake. As long as Cloud Drake exists and is good in Eddy, Eddy is just as powerful as it's always been because Cloud Drake is the linchpin card. I don't know if you've ever seen how an Eddy player runs Eddy at the top level of Eternal, but it's always Cloud Drake, Cloud Drake. It's always double Cloud Drake after 6 mana because that's just how the deck plays. It's always double Cloud Drake if it's a Demacia shell, Otherwise, if it's like a Freljord shell, it's like single Cloud Drake, Spectral Matron, or something like that, plus ramp. Like, it's always, the Cloud Drake is the linchpin of everything Eddy does, and that has not been changed. Therefore, all of these auxiliary cards with play effects, you can change them till the cows come home. It won't do anything because you just replace them with something else. So, like, what's another card that Eddy can run? Well, you can run Grim, right? You can run Grim with its play effect. You know, again, you're still running Dragon Guard Lookout in the Dragon Allegiance versions. You know, my point being is that there's always going to be stuff that you can play. You can still play Captain Erica. You know, there's stuff. It doesn't, again, Eddy doesn't really care about what the stuff is as long as it has stuff to play. You can still play champions with Eddy, right? Like Viego, Deathless. You can still do all the good broken things that Eddy does because Cloud Drake exists. Unfortunately. That's just the case. And typically, you know, you can run Lord Broadmane with Eddy. Like, nothing about Eddy has changed as long as, you know, it can still accelerate and ramp using a creature-focused high curve strategy. And nothing about that has changed, and therefore Eddy is still going to be just as prevalent. And then the last card makes absolutely no sense at all. This is like, I think the only person I've heard complaining about this card is literally Sunny. And it is specifically Yeti, right? So there's one, because of the way that Eddy works, even if you mana reduce cost cards, like you basically, you reduce the cost of cards in your hand, as long as they initially started over 6 mana, they still get the proc from Eddy. So Ancient Yeti is just one example of a card that can be mana accelerated and therefore gets a proc from Eddy below curve. So like you keep the Ancient Yeti in your hand, he comes down, if you draw him off the first round, he can come down on 4, and then he's a Deathless 5/5 for 4 mana, or whatever, which isn't even that big of a deal by Eternal standards. So again, like a lot of these changes really seem like they're just for standard players. You have a card that's getting nerfed because of the mirror, because it removes keywords in the mirror. You have a card that basically lets you, that's just a 5/5, a vanilla 5/5 with Deathless, which only really matters in standard. And then you have, you know, again, yeah, okay, we can nerf the Fire Spitter, sure. That's probably healthy and good. But at the end of the day, it's not the problem. The problem is Cloud Drake, and it's basically autopiloting 70% of games in Standard. It's also autopiloting a massive number of games in Eternal, because every single good deck is a Cloud Drake deck. Because, and again, I'll show you like what you can do in Eternal, right? So in Eternal, we'll just swap to Freljord here. And you just play any ramp card. You play Catalyst on 5. But of course it's spell mana, so really you play it on 3. So you play Catalyst on mana 3, turn 3. You can either heal for 3 or you can create a chumper. Usually you go for the chumper. But you ramp on 3, right? You guys are with me so far. You probably have successfully ramped on 2 with something like a Faces of the Old One or another ramp substitute. You play Cloud Drake on 6, because again, that's what you do. So you're playing your Cloud Drake on 6. And then you play your Spectral Matron on 8. And that's your Shadow Isles card. But because you're in Eddy, you get access to all the big cards, right? So it's just Freljord, Eddy, the Runeterra region of Eddy. But yeah, then you play Spectral Matron. And at this point, you've reduced the cost of Spectral Matron by like 2. You played Cloud Drake to reduce its cost by 1. And then you've also successfully ramped 1 time. So now you're pulling out Matron on 6. And then Matron is pulling out any 10 mana card you want, right? Any 10 mana card that you want in the entire game. He's pulling that out. So the only way to slow that deck down effectively, not just that deck, but like basically every Eddy deck ever in Standard and Eternal, is to essentially nerf Cloud Drake and just make it so it only reduces the cost of dragon cards. It's literally a dragon. Why does it reduce the cost of everything else in the game? It makes no sense from a design perspective that he is not a dragon tribal card. So yes, of course. Or again, he only reduces the cost of every card that's over 6 mana or something. Like, it just makes no sense that he just like a free mobilize on a body. Like, that is like the most powerful and broken effect in the entire game in terms of a creature play effect on 6, and nothing's going to change that. And the fact that you can play 2 of them is even more broken. So like, until that gets dealt with, Eddy is the exact same deck ever, because every single Eddy deck is a Cloud Drake deck. So yeah, very disappointed with this current patch, just because I've never seen a group of developers or so-called, you know, experts look at a problem and miss the forest through the trees so expertly. Like, anyone who has any experience with a card game who isn't just listening to what the information a small subsection of players is feeding them will instantly be like, yeah, Cloud Drake's the problem. Just remove the ramp in the Eddy shell. Then it can't accelerate anymore. And then the big cards remain heavily costed, and then the Eddy is no longer the biggest, fastest deck in the game. Like, it's literally like baby's first words. I have no other way of putting it. So monumentally disappointed with this patch. Again, I'm sure standard players will be happy that Yeti got nerfed. Oh no, not Yeti. But again, without nerfing Cloud Drake, nothing about Eddy is weakened. You just find other substitutions and other cards to play instead. This is Eternal King, signing out.